Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met with President Trump today in the White House, but his visit was cut short. Netanyahu is on his way back to Israel after a rocket fired from Gaza hit central Israel. At least 7 people were injured. Israeli authorities say Hamas is behind the attack, and since then, Gaza militants have fired at least 10 rockets toward Israel. At the White House, President Trump took action which he says will help Israel protect itself.
I will sign a presidential proclamation recognizing Israel's sovereign right over the Golan Heights. The state of Israel took control of the Golan Heights in 1967 to safeguard its security from external threats. Today, aggressive action by Iran and terrorist groups in southern Syria, including Hezbollah, continue to make the Golan Heights a potential launching ground for attacks against Israel.
And this all comes as the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee conference gets underway in Washington. U.S. leaders and others are speaking out about current relations between the two countries. More on this, let's bring in Ilan Goldenberg. He's a senior fellow and director of the Middle East Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Ilan, welcome. Thank you for being with us. You spoke at Aipac earlier today, and we will get to the conference in just a moment. But first, I want to ask you about the presidential proclamation on Golan Heights. You co-wrote a piece in Politico magazine about the disputed territory, in which you said the move, quote, damages Israeli security and undermines American interests in the Middle East and beyond, while stirring a hornet's nest that didn't need stirring. Can you explain your position on this?
Sure. I mean, the reality, first to start with, is that the Golan Heights, which has been occupied by Israel since 1967, nobody's contesting that. Nobody expects the Golan Heights anytime soon to go back to Syria, or maybe even to ever go back to Syria. But this wasn't an issue that even needed to be dealt with at all at the moment. And instead, with this announcement, suddenly you turn it into a big deal, something that didn't need to be a big deal. And why is this a problem? In a number of different ways. First, I think, and most important, Israel is dealing with a very complicated situation on its Syrian border and in the north over there, where Iran is moving into different parts of Syria, building out militias, moving in weapons and missiles that it can strike Israel with. And Israel has been responding militarily against Iran and taking out a lot of these facilities with airstrikes, over 1,000 airstrikes in the last year, in a very delicate diplomatic dance with Russia that's already there as well, and trying to make sure that it doesn't inadvertently end up in a conflict with Russia. So you have this very complicated situation the Israelis have managed to negotiate out, dealing with the Iranians, dealing with the Russians, dealing with the Assad regime, and suddenly throwing this into the mix just complicates that further, giving the Russians, the Iranians, and others an opportunity to push back and say, no, you're diplomatically isolated. This is all a plan to get the Golan, so now let's push back and limit Israel's freedom of mobility there. And so that's, I think, maybe the most important thing. It also complicates efforts that the Trump administration has pushed on any two-state agreement right now by alienating the United States from the Arab states, none of whom support this. And it also calls into question, I mean, this is just a basic principle of international law that the United States really uses to, for example, embarrass Russia and ask it to leave Crimea, or to look at other conflicts where territory has been taken by force. And if now we're saying, oh, it's okay, you're going to see all kinds of countries potentially around the world, big ones next to little ones in particular, seeing this as an opportunity to take territory in the future, or to call out American hypocrisy. So for all those reasons, this really did not seem to make a lot of sense to me.
So those are a lot of reasons. Do you think that the president's advisors would have laid all of that out for him as well? What do you think his reasoning is?
Honestly, I think his reasoning is very pure. He wants to see Prime Minister Netanyahu reelected. And this is a huge benefit for Israel. It's very politically popular, even if it's from a security perspective not popular. From a diplomatic situation, it's very popular. And therefore, I think that's really the bottom line. That's the beginning and end of it. Netanyahu asked the president to do this, and he decided he'd be okay with it. I mean, even most reports say that he never even checked with the State Department or had a decision-making and interagency process around this. So I think that that's fundamentally what this comes down to.
And that re-election bid that you just mentioned is only 2 weeks away. Netanyahu is also facing a looming indictment on a series of corruption charges. What role has that played in his run for a 5th term?
Oh, well, it's been huge. I think the bottom line is two things. One, he is facing an unexpectedly strong challenge from Benny Gantz, who used to be the military chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, along with two other former chiefs of staff. So it's a very impressive group of people who've come together against Netanyahu. And then there's also these various corruption cases that are out there, one of which broke into the news again in a big way last week, the same day that suddenly the president announced that the U.S. was recognizing the annexation of the Golan, which again took that story off the front pages and, put the Golan on the front pages, all of which is to benefit to Netanyahu. So the reality is we don't know how this election is going to go in a couple of weeks. It looks like Netanyahu is probably the favorite, but it's going to be close. It's going to be very unpredictable, and it's going to come down to some very complicated math involving a large number of small parties in Israel's parliament, and the question of which one of those get into the parliament and how many seats they get and what kind of coalition you can form based on that. So really, nobody has any idea how this election on April 9th is going to go.
All right, let's get to the Aipac Conference in which you spoke earlier. Several Democrats running for the 2020 nomination, including Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, and Bernie Sanders, did not attend this year. What message does their absence send?
So I don't think it's that big of a deal because traditionally presidential candidates don't attend in an off year like this one. I think next year, next March, would be much more significant if you have a nominee or if the primary is down to just a handful of candidates. Then if they don't attend, I think that would be a very big story. But there is this more fundamental question about the Democratic Party in Israel. I think the Democratic Party is moving on Israel. And I actually think it's kind of a healthy move, to be honest with you. I mean, I think there's been this long trend inside the Democratic Party to be more sympathetic to Palestinians and their cause, especially amongst minority groups who identify with this issue as a human rights issue. But then you've had Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has had such a confrontational approach with President Obama, and then he's followed it up with such a good relationship with President Trump that now we have this very partisan lens on the Israel relationship that didn't used to exist. And so I think that is a new phenomenon, but if Democrats come out with a position where they say we're still friends, but we can criticize Israel when we disagree with it, I think that's a healthy place to end up.
All right, Ilan Goldenberg, thank you so much for your insights.
Great. Thanks for having me.